The sun was just beginning to climb above the jagged peaks of the northern Rockies, painting the sky in streaks of rose and gold. Dust rose in lazy curls from the rutted trail as Jedediah Jed Harper tightened the reins on his weary horse. Bess, the winter had been long, and the spring promised little more than the same solitude he'd endured for the last 5 years. Jed's cabin stood on a modest patch of cleared land, surrounded by endless fields of wild grass and the towering pines that whispered in the wind. His neighbors were a distant family of ranchers miles down the trail, and the nearest town, Silver Creek, was little more than a scattering of wooden shacks and a saloon with a piano that often played off-key. Life had been honest, hard, and lonely. Jed had always imagined he'd find a partner in some ordinary way through church socials or traveling fairs. But the frontier didn't often lend itself to ordinary. Letters from mail-order brides had occasionally tempted him, each one promising a life of warmth, companionship, and home-cooked meals. He had written, hesitated, and written again, yet, somehow, fate had always held its hand back. This morning, however, a small, battered wagon rattled up his dirt road, carrying with it a promise Jed wasn't quite ready for. It was a postal delivery, a routine errand for most townsfolk, but in these parts, anything arriving at your cabin was cause for curiosity. The driver tipped his hat, squinting against the sun. "Morning, Mr. Harper," he called, swinging down from his seat. "Got a parcel for ya?" Jed wiped his calloused hands on his trousers, feeling a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. He had ordered supplies, flour, sugar, a few odds and ends for the farm, but today felt different. The parcel was heavier than he expected, bound with rough twine, and something about the weight made his heart pick up. "Thanks, Samuel," Jed said, taking the box. The driver tipped his hat again and kicked the wagon back down the trail, leaving Jed alone with the small bundle. Jed set the box on the cabin's rough wooden table, breaking the twine with careful hands. Inside, neatly folded and surprisingly delicate against his calloused fingers, were letters and bundles of fabric. Jed squinted at the first envelope, recognizing the familiar handwriting of a woman who had written him months ago, a woman he had long imagined meeting. But as he unfolded the letter, confusion clouded his features. "Dear Mr. Harper," it read, "I am eager to make your acquaintance and start our new life together." Jed blinked. He had been expecting this, and yet, as he opened the next envelope, a second letter tumbled out. Written by someone entirely different, someone from a town hundreds of miles away. And not just anyone. This letter carried the scent of lavender and a softness that hinted at a personality unlike the practical, sturdy woman he had envisioned. His brow furrowed, somehow, through the endless miles and the twisting lines of frontier mail routes. 2 letters had arrived addressed to him, each one promised companionship, each one full of hope and warmth, yet both entirely unknown. One was practical, filled with intentions of helping on the farm. The other poetic, with words that painted sunsets and imagined the stars above the Rockies. Jed sank into his chair, the letters in his hands, and let out a sigh that carried through the small cabin like the wind across the plains. He had come to the frontier seeking solitude and self-sufficiency. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The crackling fire in the stove reflected the uncertainty in his eyes. Perhaps it was chance. Perhaps it was destiny. But whatever it was, Jed knew life was about to change. And somewhere on that rough frontier, the promise of companionship, of warmth and laughter in the long, cold nights was waiting to arrive. Outside, Bess stamped her hoof against the frozen dirt, impatient for the day's work. Jed folded the letters carefully, set them beside the flour and sugar, and stood. The wind carried a scent of pine and the faint promise of rain, and Jed felt a stirring in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Anticipation. Life on the frontier was about to get complicated, and perhaps, just perhaps, it was about to get wonderful. The horizon burned with the orange glow of late afternoon as Jedediah Harper tightened the straps on his leather saddle, checking once more that Bess was ready for the long ride into the hills. But it wasn't Jed preparing for travel today, no. Today, the journey had come to him. A wagon was trundling up the dirt road toward his cabin, its wheels creaking and groaning under the weight of the unknown. Jed squinted against the low sun, shielding his eyes with a hand dusted in calluses and dirt. The figure seated on the wagon caught his attention immediately. A woman, slender but strong, with eyes like storm clouds and a gaze that didn't flinch under his stare. She adjusted the wide brim of her hat, and as the wagon rolled closer, Jed realized she was carrying a small trunk, packed tight with whatever she could bring to a new life in the remote wilderness. The driver slowed and called out in a hoarse voice, "Mr. Harper, here's the lady from." He paused, squinting at the name on the papers. The mail order arrangement. Names. Mabel Thornton. Jed's stomach tightened. Mabel Thornton. The letter he had received months ago had been practical, sensible, a plan for life on the homestead, and now she was here, framed in the doorway of his dusty horizon. Reality more vivid than any word on paper. He wiped his palms on his trousers and stepped forward, heart thumping beneath his worn vest. "Welcome to my homestead, Miss Thornton. I hope the journey wasn't too hard." Mabel hopped lightly from the wagon, her boots crunching the gravel with the ease of someone accustomed to hard work. She glanced around, taking in the sparse cabin, the wide-open fields, the stubborn mountains beyond. And Jed caught the faintest flicker of apprehension in her eyes. He gave a small nod, trying to convey that though life here was rough, it was honest and steady. The journey was long. "Mr. Harper," she said, her voice calm and even, but there was an edge of excitement beneath it. "But I reckon that's to be expected, out here." She set down her trunk with a soft thud. Dust rose around her boots, and Bess gave a quiet snort. As if curious about this new presence in the homestead, Jed lifted the latch of the cabin door, gesturing toward the small interior. "Come in. I've just got a fire going. Couldn't have you arriving with the chill of the Rockies sneaking under your coat?" Mabel smiled faintly, a ghost of amusement passing across her face. "A warm fire is a good welcome," she said, stepping inside. Her eyes roamed over the modest furnishings. A sturdy table, a couple of chairs, the stove that crackled with life, and the few personal items Jed had managed to accumulate over years of solitary living. Jed set down the kettle, the one item he prided himself on keeping polished despite the relentless dust of the plains. "I didn't expect anyone today," he said, shrugging, "except maybe a stray hawk or the mail driver." He laughed, though it was more a nervous exhale than mirth. Mabel tilted her head. "The mail always seems to carry surprises out here. I suppose that's why we write letters, so we can hope for surprises, not dread them." Jed felt a strange warmth in his chest. Her words were simple, yet precise, carrying a calm he hadn't known he craved. There was no pretense, no false sweetness, just honesty. The frontier was full of hardships and dangers, and perhaps this woman could meet them as he could hit on without flinching. They spent the evening talking by the fire. Jed pored over Mabel's letters again, realizing how well they matched the woman before him, meticulous, clever, with just enough humor to pierce through the loneliness that had weighed on him all these years. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside, the cabin felt warmer than it had in years, not just from the fire, but from her presence. As night deepened, Jed found himself lingering by the window, watching Mabel arrange the trunk's contents with care. The moon cast a silver glow over her profile, and for the first time in a long while, Jed allowed himself to imagine a life where he wasn't alone, where laughter, shared meals, and whispered conversation might fill the cabin as naturally as the crackle of firewood. Then, as if fate had decided to complicate matters further, a second creak of wheels reached his ears from the distance, the sound of another wagon approaching along the narrow trail. Jed froze, his heart skipping a beat. He remembered the second letter, the unexpected mix-up that had sent two women's words into his life. Mabel, sensing his tension, glanced up. "You're expecting someone else?" she asked softly. Jed swallowed hard, the frontier air suddenly heavy. "I might be," he admitted, the truth of it settling over him like the dust outside. "Seems the mail has its own sense of humor." Mabel's eyes twinkled faintly in the firelight. "Well," she said, tilting her head, "sounds like the frontier just got a little more interesting." Jed didn't reply immediately. He simply nodded, feeling the stirrings of adventure and something deeper looming on the horizon. One thing was certain. Life on the homestead was about to change, and this time, he might not be alone to face it. The night had settled over Jed Harper's homestead like a thick velvet blanket, the kind that muffled the world outside while keeping every sound inside sharp and alive. Bess grazed quietly near the cabin, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of the pine-scented wind. Inside, the fire cast dancing shadows across the walls, painting the cabin with the warm light of a hearth that had not seen such company in years. Jed sat across from Mabel Thornton at the small table, the letters of the past month spread before them like breadcrumbs left for fortune. He marveled at her presence, the way she laughed softly at a story he'd told of a stubborn cow that had escaped his pen just last week, or the way she examined the cabin as though imagining how life might flow within its four walls. Life felt lighter somehow, less solitary, and the edges of loneliness softened by her quiet companionship. Then, from the dirt road that snaked along the horizon, the unmistakable creak of wagon wheels pierced the night. Jed stiffened, the memory of the second letter returning with a jolt. Somehow, the mail had managed to mix up two women's letters. Two promises of a shared life, and only one homestead. Mabel noticed his tension. "Another visitor?" she asked, eyebrows raised. Jed cleared his throat. "Seems the frontier likes to play tricks." The wagon slowed at the cabin, and Jed squinted into the moonlight. There, framed against the glow of lanterns swinging from the wagon frame, stood a second woman. She was taller than Mabel, with hair like spun gold and eyes that caught the silver light like twin lanterns. Her stance was confident, one hand resting on the handle of her trunk. She introduced herself in a voice that was melodic but strong. "Miss Eleanor Prescott. I believe I'm your intended, Mr. Harper." Jed's jaw tightened. "I reckon you are," he admitted, the words tasting strange and heavy. Mabel's eyes flicked toward him, and then to the new arrival. A flicker of wariness passed over her face, but it was tempered by curiosity. "Well," she said, standing, "seems we're going to have a lively evening after all." Eleanor stepped into the cabin, brushing dust from her coat. The contrast between her and Mabel was striking. Where Mabel was calm, steady, and practical, Eleanor radiated energy, wit, and a subtle mischief that made Jed's chest tighten in ways he hadn't expected. Each woman carried the promise of a life with him, and each was entirely different from the other. The evening grew tense as introductions and polite conversation unfolded. Jed, ever the gentleman, despite the absurdity of the situation, tried to maintain composure. Mabel and Eleanor, for their part, circled each other with the cautious grace of dancers learning a new routine. Conversation flowed like a creek in spring, at times playful, at times competitive, and always edged with curiosity. "So," Eleanor said, setting her trunk near the fire, "I hear this is the only cabin for miles. It must get lonely out here." Jed nodded. "Lonely is a polite word for it, but it has its charms. Two quiet, wide-open spaces, honest work, the kind of life a man can stake his name on." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I suppose that's one way to look at it, but what about excitement, danger, adventure?" Mabel tilted her head at that, a shadow of amusement in her stormy eyes. "I'd argue there's adventure enough in planting crops, tending animals, and surviving the winters. Excitement comes in small doses, like a cow breaking loose or a river flooding its banks." Jed couldn't help but chuckle, though tension knotted his shoulders. Two women, both seemingly perfect in their own ways, both drawn by letters he had sent months ago, and now, both under his roof. How had the mail-order system managed such a feat? And more importantly, how was he supposed to navigate this? Outside, the wind rattled the cabin's eaves, carrying the faint promise of rain. A reminder that the frontier was wild, unpredictable, and unyielding. Inside, Jed felt a different kind of wildness stirring, the pull of affection and attraction, tugging at him in two distinct directions. By the time the lanterns had burned low, Jed realized he could not escape the situation. He would have to face it head-on, with honesty, courage, and a dash of humor. Both women had traveled long, endured hardship, and believed in him enough to arrive at this lonely homestead. And while his heart and mind spun like a wagon wheel stuck in the mud, he knew one thing: life on the frontier had just become infinitely more interesting. And perhaps, amidst the dust, the firelight, and the distant howl of coyotes, Jed Harper might discover that love unexpected, tangled, and complicated was as wild and unpredictable as the land he called home. The sun rose over the Harper homestead, spilling gold across the fields, but the cabin itself was anything but calm. Two women were bustling about inside, Mabel Thornton tending the small garden of herbs and vegetables she insisted could thrive even in the rocky soil, while Eleanor Prescott inspected the stacks of firewood and tried to corral the ever-curious Bess, who had become fascinated by this new, energetic visitor. Jed rubbed his temples as he surveyed the chaos, realizing that solitude, long cherished, had evaporated overnight. He had expected company, yes, but never to women. Both determined to settle in immediately, both convinced of their right to influence the life of the homestead. He paused by the door, watching the way Mabel carefully measured the water for the plants, while Eleanor tried to balance a precarious pile of logs, muttering, "If the wood falls, it's going to be someone's fault." "Jed," Mabel called without looking up, "I think we need to adjust the irrigation for the herb garden. The soil's to dry on the east side." "And Jed," Eleanor added, tossing a log aside, "we need to reinforce the roof before the spring rains hit. That last windstorm nearly blew half the shingles away." Jed swallowed hard, realizing he was caught between two efficient, passionate, and utterly different women, and neither seemed aware of how their presence was challenging the rhythm of his simple life. He cleared his throat, Ladies, perhaps we can, take turns. Focus on one task at a time. Both women paused, glancing at him with eyes that sparkled with determination and just a hint of amusement. Jed, Mabel said gently. This is the frontier. We don't have time to take turns. We need to do what's necessary, and fast. Eleanor grinned, her hands on her hips. Exactly. If we wait, the roof will leak, the wood will rot, and we'll starve before breakfast. Jed groaned, realizing that compromise was a skill he hadn't needed for years, but would now require in abundance. The day passed in a whirlwind of activity. Mabel taught him how to prune the herbs so they would thrive, while Eleanor instructed him on stacking firewood efficiently, all while Bess wandered in and out, kicking up dust and occasionally tripping over a stray boot or two. The cabin rang with laughter, chatter, and the occasional clash of opinion. By late afternoon, Jed paused on the porch, wiping the sweat from his brow. He watched the two women, side by side, working in different areas of the homestead. He realized something remarkable. While they were wildly different in personality, they both shared an unwavering determination to thrive in this harsh frontier. Mabel's practicality and Eleanor's energy complemented one another in ways he hadn't anticipated. Still, he couldn't deny the undercurrent of tension, both subtle and electric, between them. Mabel's quiet strength was a balm to his rugged spirit, while Eleanor's fiery confidence stirred a sense of adventure and unpredictability he found hard to resist. He could already feel the challenge of navigating his feelings, but the warmth in his chest told him that perhaps the universe had sent these women for a reason. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, Jed set out a simple supper: beans, bread, and fresh water. The women sat together, talking and laughing as they ate, occasionally exchanging teasing remarks that left Jed grinning and scratching his head. There was no denying it, the homestead was alive with energy, and the quiet life he had imagined for himself was now a distant memory. Later, as the fire crackled in the stove, Jed found himself alone for a moment outside, gazing at the stars. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of rain. He could hear laughter from the cabin, muffled but joyful, and felt a strange sense of contentment. Life on the frontier was hard, unpredictable, and often lonely, but tonight, it was vibrant, alive, and full of possibilities he had never imagined. He took a deep breath, allowing the quiet night to wash over him, and realized that the days ahead would test him in ways he could never anticipate. With Mabel and Eleanor under his roof, the homestead had become a place of both challenge and opportunity, of companionship, flirtation, and perhaps even love. Jed Harper smiled to himself. Solitude had its charms, but it had nothing on the chaos, warmth, and adventure that two determined women could bring to a lonely homestead in the heart of the frontier. The wind rustled the trees, carrying with it the faint laughter from inside, and Jed knew, with a certainty he had not felt in years, that life and love were about to sweep him off his feet. The morning dawned bright and calm, but the mountains held a secret. Clouds had gathered unseen, dark and heavy, rolling in from the north like a tide determined to swallow the valley. Jed Harper was the first to notice, shading his eyes against the sun, feeling the change in the wind. Bess shifted nervously beneath him, ears flicking toward the rumble in the distance. Jed, Mabel called from the garden, her hands muddy but steady. The sky looks unfriendly. We should secure the cabin. Before Jed could reply, Eleanor appeared, hauling a bundle of firewood with practiced strength. We've got maybe an hour before the storm hits, she said, her tone brisk but tinged with excitement. We need to patch the roof, tie down supplies, and make sure the animals are safe. Jed felt the familiar adrenaline surge. The frontier was unforgiving, and the first rule of survival was action, not hesitation. All right, he said, rolling up his sleeves. Let's get to it. The storm arrived faster than any of them expected. Wind ripped through the trees, bending pines and rattling the cabin shutters. Rain began in furious sheets, hammering the roof and splashing across the dirt floor. Bess whinnied in protest, running in circles as Jed secured her with a hastily fashioned rope tether. Inside the cabin, Mabel and Eleanor worked side by side, moving furniture, stacking supplies, and tying down everything that could be swept away by the wind. The tension from the previous days, the subtle rivalry over Jed's attention, seemed to vanish in the face of necessity. There was no time for hesitation, no room for pride, just survival. Jed joined them, carrying barrels of water to prevent flooding and reinforcing the door against the storm's fury. He glanced at the two women, their faces flushed with effort and determination. In that moment, he realized how extraordinary they both were. Mabel's quiet efficiency and Eleanor's daring improvisation balanced perfectly, like two halves of a whole. The wind howled, shaking the cabin walls, and lightning flashed, illuminating their determined faces. A clap of thunder rattled the windows, sending a shiver down Jed's spine, and for the first time, he admitted to himself that he cared deeply for both women and that this storm might change everything. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion set in. The rain seeped under the eaves, puddles forming on the floor, but the trio refused to give in. When a particularly large gust threatened to lift the roof shingles, Jed grabbed a hammer and joined Eleanor on the roof, while Mabel reinforced the beams below. "You're fearless, I'll give you that," Eleanor shouted over the roar of the wind, her hair plastered to her face. "Not fearless," Jed yelled back, "just stubborn enough to survive." Mabel's steady voice carried from below, "Careful up there, both of you, the shingles aren't worth a broken arm." Even amidst the danger, laughter found its way between the shouts. They were alive, working as one, and the storm had forged a bond stronger than any casual conversation or quiet evening could dot by nightfall. The worst had passed, the cabin had endured, the animals were safe, and the trio collapsed inside, soaked and exhausted but triumphant. The fire crackled brightly, throwing warm light across faces streaked with rain and mud. Silence settled over them, broken only by the occasional pop of the stove and Bess snuffling at the door. Jed looked at Mabel and Eleanor, gratitude and admiration shining in his eyes. "We made it," he said softly, "all of us." Mabel smiled, brushing wet hair from her face. "Seems we're better together than apart," she said quietly. Eleanor leaned back against the wall, still breathing hard but smiling, her eyes sparkling. Who knew a storm could be so productive? Jed chuckled, feeling the tension of the past days melt away. The storm had tested them, pushed them to their limits, and yet it had revealed something essential. Together, they could survive anything the frontier threw at them. And in that shared struggle, there was a new closeness, a warmth that no fire could match. As they settled by the hearth, drying off and sharing a simple meal of bread and stew, Jed realized that life on the homestead had changed forever. The storm had brought more than danger. It had brought connection, laughter, and the undeniable spark of something deeper, something that promised love, companionship, and the adventure of a lifetime. Outside, the wind had softened to a whisper, and the first stars peeked through the clouds. Inside, Jed Harper, Mabel Thornton, and Eleanor Prescott knew one thing for certain. Whatever challenges the frontier held, they would face them together, and for the first time in years, Jed's heart felt fully alive. The morning after the storm brought a crisp, clear day, the kind that made the mountains shimmer with frost and the air taste like possibility. Sunlight spilled across the Harper homestead, glinting off puddles still clinging to the dirt, and warming the cabin walls where the fire had done its best to dry the soaked occupants. Jed Harper woke to the smell of coffee and the gentle clatter of dishes. He emerged from the cabin to find Mabel and Eleanor already hard at work. Mabel carefully inspecting the garden, making sure the herbs had survived the pounding rain, while Eleanor was chasing Bess, who had once again decided to test the limits of her tether. Jed couldn't help but smile. The homestead was alive with energy, but he also sensed the tension that had been quietly simmering since Eleanor's arrival. Two remarkable women, two different personalities, both vying in their own way for his attention and both making him feel things he hadn't felt in years. "Mornin', Jed," Mabel said, brushing her hands on her apron as she approached him. Her eyes softened when they met his, and for a moment, he felt the gentle pull of her quiet strength. "Did you sleep well after last night?" Jed nodded, though his thoughts were tangled. "Better than expected. Seems the storm wasn't enough to keep me awake." Thoughts of keeping the homestead intact were more pressing. Eleanor appeared, her hair still damp and tangled, her smile mischievous. "Or maybe it was thoughts of me, keeping you on your toes," she teased, giving him a wink that made his stomach flip. Jed cleared his throat, caught between amusement and confusion. "Well, I reckon I was just grateful for all the help," he said, trying to navigate the delicate balance between the two women. Mabel raised an eyebrow, her expression a mixture of curiosity and subtle challenge. "All the help?" she asked, voice calm but pointed. "I hope that includes checking the roof and the garden." Eleanor laughed, nudging Jed lightly with her shoulder. "And don't forget me, Jed. Someone had to keep Bess from taking a swim in the puddles." Jed groaned inwardly. He was stuck in the middle of two brilliant, determined, and utterly different women and he liked them both in ways that were impossible to measure. He knew he would have to be careful, respectful, and honest. But the frontier had never demanded subtlety before. The days stretched on with work and conversation, punctuated by moments that made Jed's heart beat faster than any stampede or storm could. Mabel's hands, calloused but gentle, as she tended the garden, Eleanor's laughter ringing across the fields as she tried to teach Jed the finer points of roping Bess in a game of mock cattle wrangling. Each moment pulled him in two directions at once, both exhilarating and exhausting. As the afternoon sun sank low, they gathered at the cabin to rest. The fire crackled in the stove, and for a few minutes, the only sound was the wind whispering through the trees. Jed watched the two women, noticing subtle details he hadn't before. The way Mabel's brow furrowed when she concentrated. The quick flare of Eleanor's temper when things didn't go as planned. He realized he was falling, in different ways, for both of them, and he had to understand not just his heart, but theirs. Mabel, Jed began, hesitant but sincere. I can't thank you enough for all you've done. You make this homestead feel alive. Mabel's eyes softened, and she reached out, brushing a speck of dust from his sleeve. Jed, I feel the same. It's been a long time since I've had a place to belong. Eleanor, sensing the moment, leaned forward with her characteristic grin. And don't forget me, Jed. I'm still here, and I plan to stick around, whether you like it or not. Jed laughed, heart pounding, realizing that subtlety had no place in this situation. He had two women, both extraordinary, both claiming pieces of his heart. And maybe, just maybe, the frontier could hold room for all three of them to navigate this new life together. That night, as the stars sparkled above the homestead and the wind whispered through the pines, Jed felt the stirrings of a future he hadn't dared imagine. There would be challenges, jealousies, and confusions, but also laughter, warmth, and the fierce joy of survival and companionship. The homestead, once quiet and lonely, was now a place of life, love, and sparks that promised to ignite into something extraordinary. And Jed Harper, for the first time in years, welcomed it wholeheartedly. The Harper homestead had grown quiet with the first light of morning, but not the kind of quiet that spoke of loneliness. Instead, it was the calm after days of storms, chaos, and laughter, a calm filled with promise. Birds chirped over the frost-tipped fields, Bess nickered softly near the cabin, and Jed Harper leaned against the porch, cup of coffee in hand, savoring the simple pleasure of a new day. Mabel was already outside, tending the garden with careful hands, inspecting every plant that had survived the storm. Eleanor was nearby, attempting to coax Bess into a playful trot, while simultaneously planning repairs to a sagging fence. Jed watched them, a mixture of admiration and awe swelling in his chest. He had come to realize over the past week that life on the frontier was not just about survival, it was about connection, about the bonds forged in shared labor, shared danger, and shared laughter. But today, he knew, the homestead demanded more than work. It demanded honesty. The storm had tested them. The days of chaos had challenged them, and now, Jed had to confront what had grown steadily in his heart, his love, admiration, and respect for both women. He approached them cautiously. Ladies, he began, voice steady despite the knot of nerves in his stomach. I reckon it's time we had a talk. Mabel looked up first, her calm eyes meeting his, steady and unflinching. A talk? She asked, her voice gentle but firm. Eleanor grinned, leaning on the fence with a mischievous sparkle in her eye. This should be interesting. Jed took a deep breath. The past days have been something I never expected. You both came here, strangers at first, and now, well, it feels like you've been here all my life. I can't deny that I feel for both of you, each in different ways, but no less real. The two women exchanged a glance, Mabel thoughtful, Eleanor teasing yet curious. I know this isn't simple, Jed continued. The frontier isn't simple, and neither is the heart. But I want honesty, loyalty, and laughter in my life. If there's a way we can make this work, then I'd rather try than live in loneliness. Mabel stepped closer, her hand brushing against his sleeve. Jed, she said softly, I've never known a man who sees the land, the animals, and people with the care you do. And I've never been afraid to face challenges, but I do know what I want. I want a life that's real, honest, and shared. If that includes you and maybe her too, I'm willing to try. Eleanor laughed lightly, her usual fiery confidence softened by sincerity. Well, Jed Harper, I've never been one to follow rules. The frontier is wide, wild, and full of surprises. If there's room for laughter, adventure, and a little chaos, I'll stick around. I'll help build the homestead and maybe, just maybe, build something in your heart too. Jed felt a weight lift from his chest, replaced by a warmth that matched the morning sun. He realized that love didn't always follow straight paths. Sometimes it wandered through storms, laughter, and unexpected companionship. And sometimes, the heart was big enough to embrace more than one kind of happiness. The three of them spent the day together, repairing fences, tending gardens, and laughing at minor mishaps, a wheel of the wagon tipping, Bess running through the mud, Eleanor nearly dropping a barrel of apples. The homestead buzzed with life, love, and the promise of future adventures. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Jed Harper stood on the porch, flanked by Mabel and Eleanor. The air carried the scent of pine, earth, and firewood. For the first time in years, Jed felt truly at home, not just in the cabin or on the land, but in the wild, untamed frontier of the heart. Mabel rested her hand on his shoulder, Eleanor's arm draped over his other side. "Here," Jed said softly, "is where life happens. Hard work, laughter, storms, and quiet nights. And here," he added, glancing at both women, "is where I want to face it all with you too." The wind whispered through the pines. The stars blinked awake in the twilight, and the Harper homestead settled into a rhythm both wild and tender. For Jed, Mabel, and Eleanor, the frontier was more than land. It was a place where hearts could be bold, love could be untraditional, and life could be lived fully together. And so, in the wide open plains of the West, amid dust, storms, laughter, and hope, the lonely homesteader found his perfect match, not just in one, but in the hearts of two extraordinary women. Life, it seemed, was finally complete.